Former President Jacob Zuma is being held at the Estcourt Correctional Centre in Kwazulu-Natal after handing himself over ahead of last night's midnight deadline. Zuma's imprisonment follows a lengthy legal battle to avoid the Constitutional Court's incarceration order. The country's highest court sentenced Zuma to 15 months in jail for contempt after he failed to attend hearings of the state capture inquiry. The convoy taking Zuma from his Nkandla home left after one last-ditch attempt by his lawyers to prevent their client's arrest. They asked the acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo to instruct the police to stay their arrest until judgment in the application for a suspension order, which is delivered at the Pietermaritzburg High Court on Friday. However, his foundation later tweeted that Zuma had decided to comply with the Constitutional Court order. And Samkele Maseko, our reporter, is outside Estcourt Correctional Facilities in Kwazulu-Natal, and we cross over to him right now. Samkele, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. It really is, a turning point in the country's judiciary, as some may opine. What's happening today, where you are?
At this point in time, Simpiwe, we do know that former President Jacob Zuma, as I step out of shot, spent his first night here at the Estcourt Correctional Services facility in Estcourt, here in Umchezi, where he was sent to an isolated hospital cell due to the life-threatening health situation that the former president has. He's continuously stated these in his papers to the State Capture Commission of Inquiry and to the Constitutional Court, particularly in this past weekend when he filed at the now Pietermaritzburg High Court, which heard that particular interdict which the former president was trying to stay the execution of his arrest. So essentially his ill health has been accommodated here at the Correctional Services facility. We do know and understand that he came to this facility in the early hours of the morning and was in good spirits, accompanied by his friends and by his comrades and family. There was a bit of an altercation where he was being processed and his pictures were being taken. Those close to him did not want those pictures to be taken. But in a classic jovial mood of the former president, we are told that he said, it's okay, this is a history in the making, as they will record that a former president was incarcerated here at the Estcourt Correctional Services facility. We do understand that it is expected that he's going to spend all of his 15 months, should he finish that entire term, if he's not granted presidential pardon or some sort of early parole for good behavior. But we do understand that all of those 15 months are going to be spent here in Umchezi at the Estcourt Correctional Services facility. But also, one of the critical points is that he is also being guarded by the VIP protection services of the Correctional Services Department, on the virtue that he's a very high-profile individual, a first of its kind for a former president of a democratic dispensation to be incarcerated.
Now, Samkele, and I'm reading a tweet here from the Jacob Zuma Foundation, which says that please be advised that the spokesperson of the foundation will not participate in any media engagements for the better part of today. He needs time to reflect on the tragedy that has happened. The patron of the foundation, His Excellency President Zuma, was jailed without trial. Is this an indication that the Jacob Zuma Foundation is in denial of what's happening? I mean, for them to say that this is a tragedy.
They've maintained this posture, particularly Mzwanele Manyi has maintained this posture that this is a tragedy, this is a travesty, this is an injustice. A former president of the Republic of South Africa. But on the issue of there being no trial, the former president was afforded various opportunities to file responding affidavits to the Constitutional Court when the State Capture Commission of Inquiry instituted legal proceedings against him. He opted not to do so. Instead, he released a public letter, the judiciary bashing the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, even when the commission said that they want the former president to be compelled the questions. And when the Constitutional Court compelled him to do so, he last weekend, he said that when they said he must be compelled to answer all questions, he said he would play no further any legal proceedings instituted against him by the Constitutional Court or by the Commission of Inquiry, until that last-ditch attempt when he has applied now for a rescission of his incarceration and for the Constitutional Court to review the sentence that they have given him, which will be heard on the 12th of July next week in Johannesburg through a virtual platform. Those proceedings will be sitting, and this Friday, judgment on his arrest will be given, judgment in the Pietermaritzburg High Court by Mguni. So Mzwanele essentially time that the patron of the Jacob Zuma Foundation is locked behind bars in this correctional services facility. Very beautiful and a magnificent one, if one may say, with high-tech technology built in the era of former President Jacob Zuma as the number one citizen at the Union Building. So he is said to be in a very jovial mood, but also being incarcerated in a facility that is part of his legacy when it comes to infrastructural development in the Republic of South Africa. This facility where the former president is incarcerated in takes capacity of a minimum of 5 inmates at this facility. That's if you were to only include the floor of the capacity of this correctional services facility. But as we do know that it also has bunkers, which would effectively mean it can take about a capacity maximum of about 1.4 to 1,500 inmates. But where he is currently at, he is in an isolated hospital cell of this correctional services facility due to his ill health. And we are told that he's in good spirits. We are told that those who came with him in the wee hours of the morning at about 2 o'clock, they were a bit reluctant and rebellious for him being processed, for his pictures to be taken. But in a classic style, he said that let them take their pictures. They're doing their jobs. This is history in the making for the Republic of South Africa, with many constitutional experts and legal experts saying that the Constitution reigned supreme over an individual, basically meaning that no individual is above the law. One key important point is that the former president, out of his own evolution, decided to hand himself in a classic Jacob Zuma book style. You'd remember that he was very rebellious and reluctant to step down as head of state. That interview he had with our colleague, political editor Mzwandile Mbeche. Then subsequently, his support base was ramped up. Then later on in the evening, he called and addressed the nation, announced that he's stepping aside as the President of the Republic of South Africa. That same modus operandi was used in the run-up to the former president handing himself in. You saw the political festivities outside of his home in Nkandla. You saw him being branded about and surrounded by Amabutu, where they basically never looked and adhered to the various lockdown regulations, and subsequently led to him in the late hours of yesterday evening at about 11:30 deciding to go hand himself over. The police stood down at about 10:30 from approaching the former president's home in Nkandla to go and arrest him, because a deal had then been struck, and he essentially left his home and drove towards the Kranskop Greytown direction, which subsequently his blue light convoy led him to come to this correctional services facility, avoiding any blood to be spilled.
Now, Samkele, earlier on, you touched on the issue of the rescission of sentence case, which will be had on the 12th of July. So what do you think will happen to the case? Because Zuma's imprisonment essentially forms the basis of that case.
The rescission case essentially will go ahead because the Constitutional Court did not stay his arrest. The Constitutional Court ordered that if he fails to hand himself over by Sunday evening, then the Minister of Police, the Police Commissioner Kehla Stole, must make all means necessary He reports to a correctional services facility. Hence, you saw the huge deployment of police officers in and around Eshowe, Mpangeni and Nkandla yesterday. And you saw that convoy of police vehicles heading towards his home in Nkandla. So the court application will continue with, even if the former president is still behind bars, because the rescission is essentially about his incarceration. And if the Constitutional Court rules that they then overturn their decision to incarcerate the former president, then he would be released. But if the decision is that he must remain remanded in custody and behind bars, then he will continue to further and stay his 15-month sentence here at the Estcourt Correctional Services facility. So it is immaterial at this point in time whether he is out or in, but the Constitutional Court order is specific that he must be remanded in custody and report to a correctional services facility. That was not suspended. There was no motion by Jacob Zuma's, the former president's legal team, to his arrest at the Constitutional Court. There was a last-ditch attempt yesterday evening which was not entertained by the Constitutional Court, despite some media organizations reporting that the justices at the Constitutional Court were meeting yesterday evening to discuss and to consider the former president's plea, which turned out not to be true.
All right, Samkele Maseko, I'm going to let you go for now. We'll certainly touch base with you a little later on the show. That is our reporter, Samkele Maseko, speaking to us live from the Estcourt Correctional Facility, where former President Jacob Zuma has been kept. To now move on to Eshowe, where our reporter Simpiwe Makanya is also standing by. Simpiwe, a very good morning to you. What's happening where you are?
Good morning to you, Simpiwe, and good morning to the viewers as well at home. Well, I can certainly tell you that it's business as usual here in Eshowe and surrounding areas. We have been getting reports also about the situation in Nkandla, and we can confirm to our viewers that it's basically business as usual. People are going about their business, following, of course, the scenes that we saw yesterday, where the former President of the Republic of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, handed himself over to law enforcement authorities just before that 12 o'clock midnight, which was meant to be, adhered to, or else he was going to be arrested by members of the SABC under the instruction of the Police Minister Begicele, as well as the National Police Commissioner General Kehla Sithole. Simpiwe, when we left Nkandla just after 12 o'clock, after the president had left his home to go to that correctional service in Estcourt, we can tell you that we saw quite a huge convoy of police vehicles that were already making their way to the house of the former president. It must have been about 500 meters or so away from the former president. The police vehicles were stationed there, waiting patiently for that 12 o'clock deadline, but the former president ultimately decided to hand himself over to law enforcement authorities. We did earlier on, actually, after him handing himself over to the police, spoke to one or two of his family members, and they said they were devastated and they were basically not okay. We will be here again today and giving you all the rolling coverage with regards to the reactions on the ground after the president spent his first night at a correctional facility. We will also try and get comment from some of the family members who have been for the past few days, opposing this arrest, opposing this, jail term, saying that the former president is innocent and the former president does not deserve to be sent to jail. Simpiwe.
Now, Simpiwe, let's talk about his support base. I mean, the past few days, the Nkandla homestead of former President Jacob Zuma has been a hive of activity. You were there covering, everything that is happening there. Let's talk about his supporters, because yesterday when he handed himself over, it was quite a sizable crowd, a far cry from what you've seen over the past weekend, wherein hundreds of people ascended at Nkandla, to give support to Zuma, because there have been threats that if Zuma is indeed incarcerated, then there will be bloodshed here in South Africa. So are you getting a sense on the ground that we headed towards that?
Well, Simpiwe, when we went there yesterday morning, we could just tell that police were all over the place, though they were not specifically near former President Jacob Zuma's house, but they were patrolling nearby areas, ensuring that even drivers on the road are searched. But in terms of his support outside his home, Simpiwe, the numbers were really not significant when you compare them to what we saw in the past few days prior to what we saw yesterday. In fact, it was just a handful of supporters who had been camping outside former President Jacob Zuma's house yesterday at night. Many of them were still very, adamant, jovial, singing struggle songs. Wenzeni uZuma, what has former President Jacob Zuma done? And basically showing their support to him. And we also had an opportunity to speak to his son, Edward Zuma, who said that this is all politically motivated. His father finds himself in this position because of the internal politics within the African National Congress. And of course, Simpiwe, we do know that we are still under alert level 4 of the lockdown, and it was basically going to be a challenge for those who wanted to be there to support the former president to make their way there because, of course, of the curfew that was already in place. Simpiwe.
Yeah, and speaking of threats, former President Jacob Zuma went to town at some point saying that he's willing to spill the beans just to ensure that he's kept out of jail. So anything to the contrary, or any indication that he will still spill the beans?
That's what actually Edward Zuma said also yesterday, saying that when the time is right, the family will be in a position to expose, to use his exact term, to expose those who are behind all of this that is happening. But up to now, we have not heard anything with regards to that. It remains just that, basically threats, Simpiwe.
Kanya, I'm going to let you go for now, and we'll touch base with you a little later on. That was our reporter Simpiwe Makanya speaking to us live from Eshowe. And we now move on to Jadley Polza, who is outside the ANC offices in Durban, to give us a sense of what's happening there. Now, Jadley, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. You are outside the ANC offices. Any indication that the ANC will issue a statement, or perhaps just share with us what its position is with regards to Zuma's incarceration?
Well, a very good morning to you, Sim, and to the viewers. And as we move from Nkandla all the way to Estcourt and back to Durban, we cannot separate politics when we speak of former President Jacob Zuma. We've come full circle. We've watched the support base grow for him. We've seen him now handing himself over to Estcourt Correctional Facility. But the question now, Simpiwe, is what is the ANC in the province going to do? What are supporters and what are ANC members saying with regards to his arrest? I can tell you now that we are stationed outside the provincial ANC headquarters, and I am told that there is going to be a press briefing that will be held by the provincial spokesperson. He has confirmed that Nhlakanipho and Ntombela, there will be a sitting happening here. We were told about an hour ago that is expected to commence. However, it is fairly quiet outside here. I'm just going to step out of shot, Sim, and ask Nomhle Ngubane just behind the camera to show you that outside the ANC offices is one Metro Police vehicle, and this vehicle has been stationed for the better part of the morning outside. I don't know if they are presuming that there's going to be some kind of action outside the ANC headquarters, or if supporters were going to come in their numbers and demonstrate here in support of former President Jacob Zuma. That remains to be seen, but fairly quiet here outside. What I can say is that, just looking at the time lapse from last week, we saw supporters flocking in their thousands across KwaZulu-Natal, all the way from Nkandla to Durban. The support for former President Jacob Zuma has really been strong. He does have a stronghold in the province. And the question right now is, what is this going to do to the ANC in the province? Is it going to cause more factionalism? Will there be more infighting in the party? We did see the NEC sitting over the weekend. We did see that conference taking place where Deputy Secretary General Jessie Duarte did brief the media, and she said that the BGMs need to go ahead. We are going full steam with elections. but what is happening at grassroots levels. And they are trying to ascertain that, to speak to their branch members, to speak to the ANC at the branch level and see if they can't stand in solidarity gearing towards the election. So in terms of the political dynamics, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in the province, and also what is the backing of the ANC in the province with regards to former President Jacob Zuma. How are they going to come up? How are they going to stand together, and how are they going to move forward heading to the elections come the 29th of October? That's all going to play out. But today we're going to see that media briefing taking place, and I suppose from that briefing we'll also try and gauge where the ANC in the province stands in that regard. Simpiwe.
Jadely, yesterday you were at the Westville prison, which was ostensibly where Zuma was supposed to be booked. What happened then? What happened between then and now, wherein he's now booked at the Estcourt Correctional Facilities? Was it a last-minute decision to book him there?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about where former President Jacob Zuma will go. We did hear murmurs as the media on the ground and the SABC that it will either be the Westville Correctional Facility or it will be Estcourt. So we had already known that it could be either one of the two. But the committal by Kampempe did say that he was going to Westville, and we were also adamant as the media that former President Jacob Zuma will hand himself over there. At the 11th hour, we did see that information take a turnabout, and that convoy leaving Nkandla to Estcourt Correctional Facility. Quite a shock to many of us who thought that he would be handing himself over to Westville. But you know what? With everything, we've seen things come to light. We've seen how things change in the blink of an eye, Simpiwe. That could still be the case. Nothing is set in stone. Like Samkele did mention earlier on, we're still waiting for the 12th. We're still waiting for that application to be dealt with. We're still waiting for tomorrow as well. So there's a lot of applications that they still need to deal with. There's a lot of new information that needs to come from that. And then from there, we'll also figure out where to from here. Will former President Jacob Zuma remain in Estcourt Correctional Facility, or whether in fact he will be moved once again? Like I said, this is uncharted territory. This is the first time that we're seeing a president in South Africa and possibly in the world being incarcerated without trial. The last time we saw this was during the apartheid era, so uncharted territory right now for the judiciary system. But I suppose as we navigate that, we'll wait to hear from Samkele Maseko, who's at Estcourt, where that briefing will be held with the Minister of Correctional Facilities at 12:30, and see what comes out of that with regards to former President Jacob Zuma and his stay right now at Estcourt prison.
All right, Jadely, we'll certainly touch base with you in a moment, but for now, I'm going to let you go. That was a reporter, Jadely Poser, speaking to us outside the ANC offices in Durban, and she mentioned that there will be a press statement by the ANC Kwazulu-Natal office to give us their position on where they stand with regards to this matter, and to give us analysis on former President Jacob Zuma's handing himself over to the Estcourt Correctional Service. We now speak to political analysts Sanusha, Naidu and Ongama Mtimka. A very good morning to you too. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the agenda. Now, Sanusha, I'm going to start with you. This is certainly a huge precedent has been set. So what does it mean on the political front?
Good morning to you and my colleague and the viewers. I think to a large extent, the hype around the entire issue that unfolded in the last several days, and particularly what we saw over the weekend, I think brought us to a point where we have to understand that it was unprecedented in so many ways, not just in terms of what we saw last night, which in a sense kind of had a fizzle the bubble effect because it didn't keep up with what was the intention or what was the hype that was defined around it. But I think it's all of the other stuff that happened as we got to that moment last night. And, to be a little bit facetious, I think just seeing the convoy race out of the residence and go towards the which we now know is the Estcourt correction facility, kind of took that fizz out of the bubble. Because at the end of the day, the unprecedented nature of what we see today in terms of our political body, our body politic of the state, is the fact that a number of things were unprecedented. Firstly, the rule of law and the way it was tested. Secondly, the Constitutional Court as the apex court of the land, the Constitution itself, the challenges around, if you want to call it, lockdown measures that were violated in a pandemic where we're sitting with unprecedented numbers and unprecedented fatality rates. And we see the situation unfold. And I think invariably what we are witnessing here is, yes, democracy has prevailed, the rule of law has prevailed, and the Constitution and upholding the separation of powers between the three branches of government prevailed. But the challenge here is we should not now think that this is the end of the road, because this is just the beginning of what we need to start understanding, that Mr. Zuma presenting himself, and I think he did this under duress, not necessarily voluntarily, as we are beginning to see, that he comes to this point where he is in the Estcourt Correction Facility. But where do we go from here now? It's just one moment in time for me. And I think the real challenge is now in terms of what happens. Do we now see what happens in the context of the rebuilding of a party that essentially, I don't know where it's going to go, if not forward? And how do we go forward in terms of what we have always argued in South Africa is what is democratic consolidation? And what we saw over this weekend and what we saw in the build-up to where we were last night is that there were many unprecedented moments for us. We woke up this morning to a very interesting country. I wouldn't say a changed country. I wouldn't say a different country, but an interesting country where a lot more work needs to go into the structural conditioning, our political body, our rights, our constitution. We are far from where we want to be, but nevertheless, it's a start.
It is a start indeed, but what do you think will happen to the integrity of the country's judiciary, which some feel that it has been tainted, the fact that the Constitutional Court had its own decision been contested at a much lower court? Do you think that the Constitutional Court will continue maintaining that integrity as the final arbiter of all judicial matters?
Personally, yes. I think the Constitutional Court prevailed. I mean, I think the idea that Mr. Jacob Zuma and his legal team believed that a simple letter could constitute something much more deeper and try and self-correct what they felt that the Constitutional Court could meet, whether or not, they were able to do it. It wasn't an application. It wasn't an urgent application. It was a letter, kind of a pleading to the constitutional justices to say, this is what's happening. But the letter also indicated, to a large extent, that Mr. Zuma and his legal team kind of conceded in that letter that the Pretoria High Court does not have jurisdiction. And that, for me, kind of disappoints me that we went through this political theater to eventually come to a point where Mr. Zuma presents himself and actually gets to live up to the expectation of the constitutional judgment and the order that was put in. So it was executed. Why? Why do we have to keep be taken through this drama, this political theater, every time that there's something that needs to be done, which is the right thing to do? And I think at this point in time, what also we need to understand is how many people last night, the general public, not the public in Nkandla, not the public outside of Nkandla, the general public across the country actually was sitting there waiting with bated breath, because I have a sense that people are just frustrated. They have real issues in their lives. They have real crises in their lives. They don't have jobs. They are sitting in a pandemic. Their socioeconomic status is completely in a vulnerable state of crises. And this is what we are dealt with? No, it's not on.
Let me also bring in Ongama Mtimka. He's a political analyst on the line. Ongama, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you think that the former president will serve his entire 15-month sentence?
Good morning. Thanks. So I must say first that yesterday was a culmination, albeit in part, of a titanic battle between two ideas, the efficacy of the rule of law and the idea that politics could actually be performed in a way that intimidates the effecting of the rule of law. And I'm happy that even though in part what is a winning idea currently is the idea that the rule of law will apply regardless of the power of those who, regardless of what power people wield. Whether or not he stays there, what's important for me for now is that the idea that President Jacob Zuma could position himself above political, judicial institutions and processes was confronted head on. Even though we may have been frustrated with the way in which things unfolded yesterday, but to watch through a period in which there are last-ditch attempts to try and still assert the idea that he could actually be left off the hook, and see the resolve of the state driven by his comrades. Because remember that the executive is a political arm of the state and has got latitude to actually even raise national security concerns in its approach. It didn't just willy-nilly have to follow what the judiciary said, even to the extent of, for example, precipitating a confrontation outside there. So to see the way, the excellent way in which this arrest, which was in fact an arrest, was done, underscores how committed those at the level of the executive were to seeing to it that the order is executed. Now, that's important because part of what we look at when it comes to democratic institutions is not just the separateness of the institutions and the existence thereof in their own institutional spaces, but to what extent does the relationships with each other suggest the resilience of the system? And I'm happy that yesterday we saw that.
It certainly is a proud moment for South Africa's democracy, and it proved beyond reasonable doubt that nobody is above the law, not even a former president. So what does it mean then for former President Jacob Zuma's career, or political career, as it were?
It's never easy to say. First of all, I think he's at the twilight of his career. There has been a series of political and strategic legal losses that continue to eat out at his support base. Because remember that what constitutes political support are also perceptions that somebody can come back or they add value in a particular power constellation or power network, which is important in its prospects to regain office or gain strategic power bases in order to dispense patronage. So as far as perceptions about that are concerned, it's going to be very difficult to still even have people within the NEC who want to mobilize around him. But this is politics, a lot of variables, with political and social events. So one cannot say with absolute certainty that it's going to go one way or another.
You're quite right there. It is indeed politics, and very hectic politics, must I add. And one person who I suppose is looking at these events as they unfold, and he's sitting on the fence and watching what's happening, is perhaps President Cyril Ramaphosa. You know that his opponents in the party and elsewhere have been saying that he's very slow to act when it comes to matters around these issues. And now that this is happening, this is happening. Well, what does it mean in terms of Cyril Ramaphosa's influence within the party and in South Africa?
I think his posture here was frustrating but brilliant. The choice not to be embroiled in the processes helps him to demonstrate that in South Africa, the system can work without political interference. It's frustrating because the country feels that there should have been some direction that is provided from the level of President Cyril Ramaphosa, but that could lend itself into the game plan of the Zuma faction, which suggests that because the president has got vested interest in these developments, he is in fact directing it. So by not being in the limelight, he made a strategic choice that shows it's the system that's working as opposed to the commander-in-chief per se.
He's been crying foul of being treated unfairly, and we've seen even his son Edward Zuma last night saying that he's flabbergasted at the state that the judiciary finds itself in. So do you think President Zuma was treated fairly from the word go?
I think that very interesting, and that is a question for even a scientific academic paper. I say so because you see two things about President Zuma's political legal strategy. Every time that there was a platform where he was losing, he would creatively redefine what the battle is about so that we could see the battle on the terms that he determines as opposed to the platform where he's losing. So let me talk a little less in abstract. All that was simply wanted was for President Zuma to state whether or not he was involved in state capture and apply and answer the questions honestly. When he saw that there was no way for his questions, for his answers to be taken at face value, he took exception and then redefined what the issue is about. So now we're talking about whether or not he's jailed. We're talking about whether or not he's been treated fairly, whether or not the Constitutional Court decision is unprecedented. All of those things are part of his guerrilla strategy of redefining the battle to be what he has chosen as opposed to what it was meant to be, whether or not he was involved in state capture. I doubt that the Constitutional Court justices, and in fact, in his most ambitious objectives, that Deputy Chief Justice Zondo thought that as an outcome of his report, President Jacob Zuma would be reported, never mind as a consequence of the politics and the legal issues of whether or not he should be presenting himself at the commission.
All right, Sanusha, let me also bring you into this conversation. I mean, the politics of delaying tactics, do you think they worked for Zuma?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I think we keep talking about the Stalingrad approach, and that seems to be one that has been part of the playbook of Mr. Jacob Zuma and his legal team. And at every end, it seems to have upended itself. So it seems to have contradicted the way in which the strategy was defined and implemented and the mechanization of the strategy. I do think that at this point in time, the sense one gets in terms of how this all played out in the end was the idea of keep trying to frustrate the system, keep trying to deflect attention, keep trying to find different means and ways to keep the system in a state of limbo. And I think in a way that kind of tells us that maybe the utility of the strategy hadn't been thought out in a coherent manner. That either Mr. Jacob Zuma had his legal counsel there, they were advising him, and perhaps they were advising him in a way that told him that these were the pros and cons of the strategy. But of course, at the end of the day, he is the person who has to make the decision around how the strategy should be articulated. I think that also what we got to be very careful of is just the idea that the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, needs to make a statement on everything. I think the perception we have is that he needs to get engaged in this and he needs to get engaged in that. At this point in time, that we are having a briefing later today by the Minister of Justice around what the next steps are. But again, the challenge here is it is a state issue. The institutions of the state have to basically get involved. I agree with my colleague in terms of how the security cluster and the police and those institutions articulated, interpreted, and went forward. But at the end of the day, I think the real challenge again is around the idea that when these institutions are working with each other, they also have to work with each other on the basis of anticipating what the interests are and anticipating what the implications will be. And I think what happened outside in Kanjla over the weekend, we must also agree that the police addressed that situation in a very, very mature and critical manner. But at the end of the day, it's also important to understand that these implications fuel the political dynamics, fuel the idea. I mean, when you looked at those scenes outside in Kanjla, you gave one the impression for that brief moment in time that this process was above the institutions of the state. And as much as it was a security issue, etc., I think we should have never have been there in the first place, because this is what fuels the kinds of tensions that we see coming down the pike with regard to all of this. And so we start coming back to the question of how do we make sure these institutions are strengthened, that they deepen their mandate, And I think the biggest challenge for us going forward now is also ensuring that when the police go out to carry out their mandate, particularly in terms of other areas of enforcing the law, people can actually be very, very frustrated and say, well, you didn't do it in Nkandla. Why are you now coming and challenging me? Yes, Mr. Zuma and the situation there was volatile in the context of perception. But how volatile it was, I think, is very important to unpack.
And I suppose we should read into his incarceration in isolation, because it is a totally different case from the other charges that still hover above his head. And I mean, it suffices to say that we need to wait and see whether he will serve out his 15-month sentence. And if he does, then those charges will be reinstated, I suppose. So do you think that he might face, the courts again in relation to those charges? And I mean, the scales could tip on either side.
Absolutely. I think I'm not saying that, the situation here is unprecedented. Even his arrest and because of a contempt of court order. I mean, that in itself is some people are arguing that it's a small offense. Now, the bigger offenses are coming down the line. The bigger offenses with regard to on July 19th, depending what the Constitutional Court rules after they hear the application of President Zuma's legal team about the rescission of the judgment by the Constitutional Court made last week. Whether or not they uphold it, whether they reduce the sentence, it all is up in the air until we get that judgment from the Constitutional Court. But if the judgment states, if the Constitutional Court says on the 12th, or however time they take to deliberate on the judgment, and when they make a decision, remember July 19th, or somewhere in July, there is the question of going back to court around the arms deal. Now, all of these things are coming to a head. So it's just one avenue and one set of avenues that we have to start thinking about in terms of Mr. Zuma's legal woes, because these are a number of legal woes that he has to now contest in different spaces. And I think at the end of the day, it becomes quite an embattled area for him and his legal team to start thinking about these things in terms of how do they navigate these different spaces. So, this is one small little area within a bigger picture that we are seeing in terms of what Mr. Zuma has to face coming with regard to his legal challenges that he has to now navigate through in going forward. So at the end of the day, I think, whether you have a parole, whether he's paroled, I don't know if that's still possible, but whether or not you have the 15-month sentence reduced, or whether he has to serve a 15-month sentence, depending on how many applications his legal team makes to have that reviewed, etc., depending on the outcome of the Constitutional Court's hearing on the 12th, it's all going to be quite interesting. And I'm not sure whether we are entering a process where we have to be much more clearer about looking at this, what happened last night, looking at the implications of this going forward, but also remembering the big picture in all of this.
All right, Sanusha, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And we do appreciate your thoughts and your sentiments on this matter. That was political analyst Sanusha Naidu, and we were joined earlier by Ongama Mtimka, and unfortunately he had to leave because he has to attend some business. And to get more reaction from political parties, from opposition political parties, we now have on the line Pieter Groenewald. He is a leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Dr. Groenewald, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. What's your reaction to what unfolded last night?
Good morning, Sapiwe. Well, firstly, the Freedom Front Plus welcomes the fact that Zuma over to the police. By doing that, I mean, a confrontation has been avoided. And I think Mr. Zuma realized that he doesn't have the political support he thought he had. I think that the incidents at Nkandla over the last weekend was nothing else than a show of force and was only a smokescreen. He did the right thing. And of course, for the police services as well as for justice, that is a victory because nobody is above the law. And the question still remains, what treatment Mr. Zuma will receive when he is in jail? Is he going to receive preferential and special treatment? I foresee that they will send him to a hospital. He is not a very healthy man. And I think with what everybody is asking, are we going to have a second shall we shake situation? And I don't want to go into those details. The fact of the matter is that we will still have to see how it is further going to fold out and roll out when it comes to Mr. Zuma when he is in jail.
Do you think Mr. Zuma has been treated fairly since the case started?
In which?
Has he been treated fairly since this case started? Did he receive fair treatment?
Yes, of course he has been treated fairly. I mean, Mr. Zuma had many opportunities to go and put forward his case. I mean, Mr. Zuma is on record where he said in Parliament, even when he was still the president, he said that he would like to have his day in court. And I know and I understand that his appeal now is actually that he was ill-informed and advised by certain legal advisors. The fact of the matter is he had ample opportunities to go and put forward his case. And I think in a certain sense it was quite irresponsible from him as a former president of South Africa to wait up till the last minute to defuse the situation. This example in that sense is not a good example set by Mr. Zuma. So yes, he's been treated very fairly. He should not complain the way he had been handled because, again, nobody is above the law. And we must remember, if we talk about the situation of Mr. Zuma, we must always compare it to ordinary citizens. You know, the Constitution of South Africa is very clear on this matter. We are all equal when it comes to the law in South Africa. And it doesn't matter on the position you held in society, whether you were a former president, whether you're a member of parliament, whether you're a director or a CEO or whatever, we are all equal. And we must compare that and to keep focus and to keep and ensure that we really understand the whole situation of Mr. Zuma. He is an ordinary citizen that must be treated like all other citizens in South Africa. And that's what the people wanted to see. So he has been handled more than fairly in this whole situation.
Dr. Pieter Groenewald, joining us on the line. Thank you so much for your time.
Welcome.
That was Dr. Pieter Groenewald, leader of the Freedom Front Plus, just sharing his party's reaction to former President Jacob Zuma's imprisonment.